In today's video, we're going to go over VIP ChessGoals member Bob's game. We've seen Bob before on the YouTube channel. This is something that I do for the VIP patrons, analyze some of their games for YouTube. So Bob's got the white pieces here, and we're going to analyze this one with the engine. So I'm in chess.com here. I have the engine evals running, and I'm going to show you guys how I go through this game and look for takeaways. So here we have an English opening with c4. Black plays knight f6 and knight to c3. And now we see e4 by white. So this is building a big center. And this is a common setup. And Bob uses this one quite a bit. The idea is usually you put the bishop on g2, play d3, bishop e3, knight e2, castle. It's a system-based opening. You can kind of play the same move order every time, and it's very solid and gives white a comfortable game. Bishop g7, bishop g2, castle, knight e2, a6. Now, this is the first move that strikes me as a little bit strange by black. Why play a6? And the reason I say that is because if you look at the center, white already has pawns on c4 and e4. This controls a lot of central space. Black only has the pawn up on d6 in the middle of the board. It guards c5 and e5, but it doesn't fight for any of these squares on the fourth rank. So I'm thinking here I would expect black to play either e5 or c5 and try to fight for the dark squares. When I see a move like a6, and the engine eval confirms this, it's a little bit too passive. I think I would jump on this and just switch gears a little bit, Bob. Instead of d3, I would play d4 here. Go for this big space advantage and play it this way. This is something that could transpose into sort of a King's Indian structure with e5 or c5 still. Or it could even transpose into a Marazzi bind if c5 takes on d4 and the knight takes back. But this gives white a comfortable space advantage, and if you can add this to your repertoire, I think you're going to get an even larger advantage out of the opening sometimes. So castle was played, c5, d3, knight c6, h3, and this is a common move. You want to put the bishop on e3 and not have the knight attack your bishop from g4. Rook to b8. And black's plan here is to expand queenside. Works well with that bishop kind of cutting across the board. f4. Knight takes d4, c takes d, knight e2. Now, this pawn, you might be wondering, is this a strength or a weakness for black? We see black has doubled pawns on the d file, but this pawn is also fixed on the d4 square, kind of controlling some of these dark squares in white's camp. So black has a pawn on their 5th rank, 5 ranks up for black. All of white's pawns are on the 4th rank, right? So this is the most advanced pawn on the board for either side. It's a strength and a weakness, to be honest. It's blocking in this bishop as well. So what white needs to do here is figure out, how can I work around this pawn? And there's a few ways to do it. I like what Bob did here. He plays pawn to f5. So he's saying, okay, I have these pawns on the light squares pointing at your king, and my rook on f1 behind this pawn on f5. I'm going to try to open up your king position and attack kingside. This makes a lot of sense to me. Pawn to b5. So now black is threatening b takes c4. And this is a big decision. I think the best move is probably to take. And the reason I say that is because let's say pawn takes back. This pawn on b5 is trying to target these 2 pawns for white. So white has a 2 versus 1 pawn advantage on the queen side. That's a potential pass pawn even coming down the a file. And this is going to be very slow for black to create any play, with that bishop shut down on the diagonal. So the bishop can't attack b2 currently, and this will free up time for this kingside attack that Bob has going. So that would be my recommendation, capture on b5. After b3, I think this gives black a little bit of play because now we see this rook can drop down and there's access to this backward pawn. That's the weakest pawn on the board for white. It's the base of this V pawn structure. Black can get to this pawn pretty easily by bringing the knight out. So small difference there, but I would recommend capturing on b5 instead. So now black just has a little bit of an edge. All right, so now we get a trade on g6, knight to f4. It's a good move. King to h2. Engine's complaining a little bit about this move. I think it's just due to the tactic with pawn to g5 specifically, but I like the idea. I like playing king h2. The king helps guard g3, and this allows white to continue the attack. This knight is free to move. Rook f3, good move. Bishop a3. So one thing I'm wondering here is if Bob is thinking of capturing the knight. With a closed position like this, I think that move could make sense, but the downside is this is the good bishop for white. The bad bishop is here on g2. So this is a bad bishop because it's the same color as all of these pawns. So knowing that this is the good bishop, I would probably keep this guy back. Maybe play a move like knight to d5, open up that bishop over to the king side. That's going to be an attacker. And then let's see if we can get this a1 rook over to f1 next. So something like bring the bishop out, move the queen up, maybe to d2, put the other rook on f1. Bishop a3 played pawn g5, knight to e2. So here, I think knight h5 is a cool move. If queen takes knight, there's rook takes rook check, picking up the queen. So black actually can't take this knight, and the queen on d1 will defend it. So that's kind of a nice aggressive move, throwing the knight up there. Okay, knight e2 played, rook takes, bishop takes. This is a good game by black so far. I think he's holding his advantage here. Queen f7, occupying the open f file. And one thing I always like to say to students, when there's an open file on the board, I say, what's the most important thing in the position? More often than not, it's the open file. So right now there are two open files, F and B. Black is controlling both of them currently. So that's something that white should try to do. Fight for those open files, see if he can contest the F and B files with the queen and rook. H5 played, queen to D2, nice aggressive move. Knight comes back to defend G5. Rook F1, lining up with the queen. So even though we see this eval bar bouncing around quite a bit, it's a tactical position, and I like the practical chances of this move, trying to create some problems for black. H4, knight E2, take, take. So black again is doing a good job here. This knight is pinned down. G4. That feels a little over aggressive because now white's starting to get play on the queen. Bishop to F4. And this is a blunder. This is a huge blunder by black. So the problem with bishop to F4 is the bishop is now pinned down to the queen. So black voluntarily walked into this pin. Really moving the queen here is best, probably, like queen out to H5. The computer's saying even knight to F4. So not allowing the bishop to get pinned on F4, but putting the knight out there. It's probably a little bit stronger because now this bishop helps out on the light squares. Here, queen to E1 is played. Queen to D1 is the refutation to this move. And let's just give black kind of a logical looking move to CY. Rook to F8. Bishop to C1 can be played. Bishop and rook both lined up with here with the bishop. The queen moves. Bishop takes G4 can be played. Now white's up 1 point. And with the bishop on G4, everything is looking pretty secure for white. And this knight on E6 is now pinned down. So white was very close here to breaking out with queen to D1. Queen to E1 played. There's only one move for black that holds the big advantage. It's knight to G5. This is just super complicated though. Rook to F8 is played. I don't blame black. And now Bob finds the best move. Bishop to C1. Great move. Hitting the bishop, which is still pinned to the queen. Queen H7. Bishop takes G4. So now white's got that slight edge. You see the eval bar creeping up. The kingside structure is safe for white, or much safer than it was, and white's up 1 point of material. Bishop E5. We see a rook trade, bishop trade, and queen to E2. And I like what white's doing here, playing aggressively. Couple checks, brings the queen back. So at this point, white should be thinking, okay, how do I push this advantage to play for a win? And I think the answer is actually the H-pawn. Can you get that H-pawn pushing up the board? That's the extra pawn. You can safely push that up the board. I think that's how you play for a win. So I would start here with H4 right away. Bishop E1. So it looks like both sides are just kind of waiting around to see who's going to overpress. Some jockeying for position. And now we see an aggressive move by black, bringing the knight out to A4. I'm not sure what the plan here is. Knight to C3, knight to B2, something along those lines. But there's a very strong reply, bishop to B4, picking up this A-pawn. This is giving white a nice advantage. If knight to C3, you can take. And if knight takes A2, Now knight to g1 can be played, or even pawn to c5, and this knight is sort of out of the game. Like let's say pawn takes, bishop takes. We see this is double attacked, and the black king is more exposed than the white king. So black's got to be very careful here. Okay, knight f4 played, queen h6, bishop g3, takes. All right, so now black was able to win the pawn back, but this bishop against knight is still an interesting dynamic. The bishop has more long-range possibilities, like maybe it can win both of these pawns. The knight is already pressuring this pawn on a2, which can only be defended by the queen. So I think here this is close to a draw with best play, because if one side is worse, which I feel like in this case white is close to being worse, usually there's chances to go for which is perpetual check. White can check down here and try to keep checking back and forth. I think coming up, the players got into a little bit of time pressure. Yeah, and right here, Bob blunders with queen to e7, because after the queen trade, knight takes a2 is threatened, and there's nothing white can do about it. But I think this was a really high-level game. Bob, you played well, and I think the main takeaways, I would say move 7, maybe look to play d4. Add that to your repertoire, add a little bit of space in the center when black gives it to you. And then right here, I think you had the right idea. Play for the kingside attack. I would recommend going c takes b5 here as a way of slowing down black's play. Not as easy to get to this d3 pawn when the b file is closed up. And that will make it a little easier to continue with the kingside attack. And then at this point, move 20. Knight to d5. I like this move a lot as a way to try to organize those last pieces. So you had the right idea going for that kingside attack. This might just be a little bit quicker of a way to get these pieces into the game. And then this was just a crazy tactic. This is not easy to see, but queen to d1 is the stronger move over queen to e1 due to this play on the g4 pawn. But I think that's one where you just have to spend the time, look for it, see if you can find it. If you can't find it, that's okay. Go with what your gut instinct tells you, and that was queen to e1. But you fought back well, stayed in the game, had this close to equal endgame for a long time. I think somewhere in this region of the game, you should look to push the h-pawn up the board. Maybe if you can get a queen trade and make sure this pawn stays safe, that could be one way to play it. Try to use your extra h-pawn. Your king is a little bit safer than black's, so that could be one reason to keep the queens on the board. All right, thank you, Bob, for submitting your game, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought of the game in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good day.